All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel where we look at esoteric and obscure varieties of theories of everything in general. All encompassing theories that would really benefit your life if you knew about them. But they are so far on the margins that you probably don't. And today is our 275th video on the reciprocal system of theory, which was authored by Dewey B. Larson back in the 20th century. He died in 1990 after 60 years of working on the reciprocal system. About the first half of that time was spent ironing out the kinks in his mind with the process of induction until he wrote down his two fundamental postulates in basically two sentences. And then once he did that, he went through a process of deduction. And he derived an entire theoretical universe about how the universe operates. Wrote some books on chemistry and physics and astronomy and metaphysics and economics, astrophysics, and some other subjects. And his followers have continued on after his death to move it into even more fields. And we're going to be looking at one of those today, which is from Dr. Bruce Perret, who started studying the reciprocal system, I guess, back around in the 80s. I think Larson was still alive. I don't believe he ever met Larson. But he, more than anyone except for possibly Dr. KVK Nehru, has done more to update the reciprocal system since Larson's death and kind of work out some of the mistakes, some of the rough patches that Larson left behind. Now, Larson was adamant that his theory was correct, but he did admit that the way he applied the theory was subject to error, and that those errors would become obvious over time. And so that's kind of what happened. And so Dr. Perret has come up with something that's called RS2, Reciprocal System 2, the reevaluation of the reciprocal system. Unfortunately, Dr. Perret also passed away about 3.5 years ago. And so now again, we're trying to pick up the pieces and move the theory forward. And it's being done with very, very, very little support or knowledge by anybody that's kind of outside of the kind of original group that is aging. And there are very few people that, and in fact, I've been studying the reciprocal system since about 2001, and I have never met anybody personally who knows anything about it. Never met a single person who's even heard of it before. There are people out there, and I've met them, by internet. I've met some, and I've informed many others, but I've never met a person, that has learned about it independently, of me. Okay, now the basic idea behind the reciprocal system is that we live in a universe that is made entirely of motion. Not matter, not energy, but motion. And motion, for Larson, was the relationship between space and time. Space and time are two components of a fraction that is motion. So motion is a fraction or a ratio that contains space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. It sets up a reciprocal relationship between space and time. Now, that whole thing is clouded by basically three caveats that come from his first postulate. One is that space and time both are coordinate, meaning that they both have three or four, I would say. He says three. I say four because of Buckminster Fuller's tetrahedral coordinates, but we'll say three dimensions, XYZ coordinates, and space or time both have their clock aspect, meaning that they have a scalar motion, a motion that has a magnitude but no particular direction, like a clock. The clock is always getting later and later and later, but really in no particular direction. And so that is what Larson calls clock time. But then there's also clock space, which means that space is always getting farther and farther and farther apart, but in no particular direction, which you can envision using a balloon with dots on it that you blow up. You blow up the balloon, all the dots are moving away from each other. The Hubble telescope also observed that all of the distant galaxies are moving away from each other. These are the progression of space, or the flow of space, clock space. And then space and time also only come in discrete units. They are quantized. There is a minimum unit of time and a minimum unit of space. And if you don't have a full unit, you don't have anything. Or you don't have that thing. So if you don't have a full unit of space, you don't have space. And actually, if you don't have space, then you only have time. And also, if you have 1 unit of space in 1 unit of time, you have the speed of light. Larson calls that unit speed, and unit speed is the neutral point of this universe of motion. And there's half of the universe that's moving faster than the speed of light, and half of that he calls the cosmic sector, and half of the universe that's moving slower than the speed of light that he calls the material sector. And that is the sector that we're more familiar with, and that is the sector of coordinate space and clock time. But if we cross the boundary over into the cosmic sector, then the relations of space and time flip or invert. And when we go to the cosmic sector, we have coordinate time and clock space. And that shows that reciprocal relationship again. Anytime you cross that boundary, you have to invert the space and time relationships. And that also creates powerful extrapolation procedure, because the legacy scientists know a great deal about the material sector, and they know pretty much absolutely nothing about the cosmic sector. Einstein's dicta was that the speed of light is the maximum speed of the universe. So he was only concerned with the material sector and did not know anything about the cosmic sector. But according to the reciprocal system, what's going on in the cosmic sector is exactly the same as what's going on in the material sector, except that the relations of space and time are inverted once you cross over that boundary. Okay, now that's just kind of a short version of that's really the first postulate. The second postulate is not as important, and Perret has had issues with it, but it says that the universe conforms to the relations of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its magnitudes are absolute and its geometry is Euclidean. Euclidean is like XYZ coordinates, but Perret says that the universe is actually projective, of which Euclidean is a small subset. Okay, now we have been reading this particular article from Dr. Perret, who writes under the pen name of Daniel Phoenix 3 in times where he's writing kind of more speculatively. And this article is called Time and Timelines. And this is the 4th episode of that article. So if you want to go back to the start, go back a few episodes on this YouTube channel. And this section here is called Project Camelot Video, Dan Burrish. I have some comments on the Project Camelot Dan Burrish video where he is talking about the Orion Cube, looking glasses, and timelines. The Orion Cube was the core of the Montauk chair used to direct temporal experiments. Okay, the other thing I didn't say is that Daniel Phoenix 3, his pen name, is a character who was said to be one of the young computer programmers back in the early 1980s who was working on the Montauk Project, which was a government top secret black ops time travel project. Okay, so the Montauk chair, I believe, was a reverse engineered capture from some alien craft, and they used it for their own temporal experiments. Okay, so the Orion Cube was the core of the Montauk chair used to direct temporal experiments. The cube is actually the navigation computer from an SM, or Saurian men, or spacemen spaceship, probably one of the smaller scout vessels. Consider that in order for a spaceship to travel faster than light without time dilation, it must be able to successfully navigate through coordinate space and coordinate time simultaneously. Essentially, the cube provides a window into both realms for the pilot to navigate with. Now, one point that Perret makes that he's not making here is that basically the material sector and the cosmic sector both exist in the same space and time simultaneously, but they are out of phase, like 90 degrees out of phase. So they both are there, but you really only can tune in one at a time. Or I suppose you can tune in both of them at the same time, but they operate along different lines, and it's like they are transparent to one another, but you have to basically learn how to understand both of them at the same time. Generally, our consciousness only picks up the material sector, but we, through various trainings, especially through dreams, we can also inhabit this cosmic sector, also death. We can inhabit this cosmic sector and learn to operate along those rules as well. Okay, essentially the cube provides a window into both realms for the pilot to navigate with. What happens with faster than light travel is that as you pass the speed of light, the spatial dimension in the direction of travel shifts into the coordinate time realm, as speed is a reciprocal relation between space and time. Cross the barrier and you start having a temporal dimension instead of a spatial one. But since time is 3D and not a 1D vector, you have to keep the ship going straight in the coordinate time realm, which means you need to be able to see the realm to properly navigate it. Um, just trying to read his footnotes here to make sure that that there's nothing that you need to know urgently in the footnotes. His footnotes are useful. Some of them are humorous, but they're not always, you know, completely relevant for at least for educational purposes. Okay, but since 3D time is not a 1D is 3D, not a 1D vector, you have to keep the ship going straight in the coordinate time realm, which means you need to be able to see the realm to properly navigate it. This is what the Orion cube does. Upon transition to faster than light velocity, the volume of the ship has been altered to 2 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, which means that in space it appears as an area, not a volume, usually a flat disk or saucer shape, depending on the faster than light speed. It gets flatter the faster it travels beyond the speed of light. Again, the reciprocal relation, more time, less space, and vice versa. In time, it is cylindrical or jet-like a meteor streaking through the temporal landscape that needs an accurate flight path so it arrives at both the correct location in coordinate space and in coordinate time. In the Phoenix 3 project, they still had all the bits of the ship's navigational system, the cube, interface, and the pilot seat. The Montauk chair setup described by Preston Nichols, Al Bielek, and others. That's what we ended up hooking to the IBM mainframes, which were essentially a simulation of the responses of the spacecraft, though they didn't tell us that. They knew the ships traveled faster than light, so they knew the device could somehow affect time, and the project was built upon that principle. They were able to fool the navigation system into thinking the craft was accelerating past the speed of light so it would open the temporal navigation window, the vortex, even though it remained fixed in space. Of course, that created a few other problems, as occasionally happens with simulations versus reality, like the oddball wall disappearing and strange behaviors of animals in the vicinity. It appears they either had other cubes from other craft or pulled the one from Montauk prior to the abandonment of the project in 1983. I'd bet they just placed the room full of IBM mainframes with a PC these days. Probably a lot more computing power than we had back then, which made the device much more portable. From what Burrish related, it doesn't look like things changed much. They're probably still using my original chair driver code I wrote for the IBM. I don't know what they did for the interface, as the chair required a person with psychic ability or psionic ability to use it. I'd guess they reverse engineered some sensors to pick up the general psycho-emotional activity in the immediate area to control the projection into coordinate time. Without some kind of pilot, it would be random and useless. The looking glass is not the same technology. It has all the properties of the sun disk of Mu, so I still believe it was reverse engineered from that artifact. Now, probably a lot of you who follow that 17 have heard quite a bit about looking glass technology, and so this might be relevant to you from one of the people who claims to have been there. Okay, now I assume they disbanded the looking glass technology not for the sake of humanity, but because it stopped working. The original sun disk, according to the Peruvian records of the elder race, made use of the naturally occurring gravitational null nodes, also called a vortex, dead spot, or in conventional science, a wormhole or Einstein-Rosen bridge. This allowed simple access to the coordinate time realm through the use of vibrational control, song, chant, mantra, and instruments. But as our conventional technology became more and more based on electromagnetism, with the corresponding strong electromagnetic fields of power distribution, it literally pushed these nodes off the surface of the planet, though they do continue to occur in the upper atmosphere and nearby space. Without a nearby node to lock onto, the looking glasses stopped functioning. Of course, if something were to interfere with the power distribution on a planetary scale, then these devices would once again start working. Regarding the timelines, we are still on the Montauk-generated timeline, which is called TIV83. That has just about collapsed. The detour in the temporal landscape is rejoining the original road, along with the time lateral imposed by the Confederation many years ago. When both of those routes terminate, which should be by the end of this year, and he was writing back in, I think, 2012, but when both of those routes terminate, which should be by the end of this year, we will be back on the natural timeline. Okay, just looking over these footnotes again. This confederation, he also calls them the Divine Council or the Andromedan Council. In other words, we'll be walking on the road to where evolution is supposed to take us, through three-dimensional time. A timeline 0, T0, timeline 1, T1, and timeline 2, T2, are both artificial detours, with different groups erecting barricades and detour signs in the temporal landscape, trying to direct the population down these paths. The timeline 1 detour signs are environmental disasters that are designed to increase the global temperature by several degrees. This is the New World Order's preferred route. What the timeline is structured to do is to first increase the global temperature through the introduction of hydrocarbons into the atmosphere, not from flatulent cows, but something on a much larger scale, say something way out in left field, puncturing the Earth's crust where it is very thin at the bottom half of the Gulf of Mexico to allow almost limitless hydrocarbons, oil and gas, trapped in the asthenosphere to escape into the atmosphere and cause a massive greenhouse effect. Not that something like that could ever happen, right? The petrochemicals will raise the Gulf temperatures substantially, alter the natural course of weather systems in the northern hemisphere, and raise the global temperature 2 to 3 degrees centigrade, which will actually give the northern hemisphere a rich growing season for a while, at the expense of the southern hemisphere, which will be ecologically devastated. Of course, land there will get really cheap and be bought up by the big oil folks. How much of Chile and Argentina has Bush Company bought? Or Bush Corporation bought? One more accident, in quotes, in the northern hemisphere to kick the global temperature up another 2 degrees, and the northern hemisphere becomes a wasteland with few residents, while the southern hemisphere will flourish. Of course, all the powers that be will be nice and comfortable in their new southern hemisphere paradise. Easy solution to get rid of the third world undesirables first, then reduce the world population significantly, as the bulk of the population is in the northern hemisphere. Timeline 2 runs into a major storm in the temporal landscape due to the solar transition. Both timeline 0 and timeline 1 just catch the edge of the storm. Timeline 2 runs right through the middle of it. This is when the Earth experiences a core flare that people have been interpreting as some kind of galactic or solar micro wormhole event. It actually has to do with the solar magnetic ionization level, not wormholes, which will take a significant hit as our solar system crosses the galactic magnetic sheet. If you note in the timeline 1 and timeline 2 scenarios, time-traveling humans are present, designated P24, P45, and P52 by Burrish. Take a close look. Both groups are still third density and no longer on Earth. This should tell you something about what T1 and T2 are designed to do in the long term, to put mankind back into another third density cycle, rather than to advance to fourth density, which is the route of timeline 0. Okay, that is the end of that section. Again, take it for what it's worth. You may understand some of it, you may not. You might want to look at it a few times to see if you can grasp it. And the next section is called The Realm of Coordinate Time. And we will be tackling that one starting tomorrow. But thanks for tuning in today, and have a beautiful day.